Over the last few years, employers across BC and around the globe have experienced the impact of climate change. Warmer winters, drier summers, bringing an increased risk for wildfires. This past winter alone, much lower than average snowpack, and fire bans already in effect for parts of BC and Alberta, with over 170 wildfires already burning as of last weekend. And yesterday, parts of Chetwynd have been evacuated due to an uncontrolled wildfire, and it's only April. This is not the only climate event. Sudden storms and heavy rains can cause slides and quickly erode riverbanks, increasing the risk of flooding. The term atmospheric river has made its way far too often into the news since the Fraser Valley flood of 2022, and we all remember the devastation this brought to the BC Lower Mainland and transportation and supply routes that impacted all of us here in BC. And of course, we're also in an earthquake zone. So are we ready for this? All these factors can impact our businesses in different ways and our families and communities. And it's up to us, each of us, to be ready to respond, to face the consequences that can be catastrophic if we're not prepared. In today's webinar, our guest, Paul Breed, will talk about business continuity, the pre-planning and preparation required to ensure that your business can continue to operate after a disaster in the most efficient, effective way possible. His talk will cover what business continuity really means and why you need to plan for it now, the 6 professional practices behind business continuity, and what you can do today to build resilience into your organization. Paul is a retired senior UK police officer, curriculum developer, and university lecturer for several post-secondary institutes, focusing on emergency management, business continuity, and organizational resilience courses. Former head of emergency preparedness, business continuity, and resilience for a large national health service trust in the UK, Paul also led business continuity lead in emergencies for the ministry here in BC of Advanced Education and the Ministry of Health. Welcome, Paul, and thank you for joining us today. Before I pass the floor over to you, a reminder to our participants here today to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions anytime during the session. Thank you once again for joining us. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll just share my screen in relation to the presentation. So hopefully you'll be able to see the presentation. So hopefully it's on the screen itself. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to yourselves today as well. And please feel free to call out in relation to any questions as we go through the session. The session itself, there will be natural pause points in relation to perhaps asking some poignant questions in relation to how prepared you are in relation to dealing with business continuity events, and that could be an incident, a crisis, or a disruption. So please feel free to engage in that process, because I tend to find that the more engagement that we have, the better learning that we have in relation to business continuity as a concept and as a discipline. So the agenda itself, we'll talk about, first of all, what is business continuity. There are lots of myths and I would say confusion around what business continuity is. Equally, there's confusion about what business continuity isn't. So I'll try to break that down in relation to what is deemed business continuity within the international standards perspective. I'll also talk about very briefly about integrated crisis and business continuity management response framework, in the sense of identifying risks pre an event actually taking place, then what normality looks like, and then that escalation from an emergency through to business continuity, through to a crisis, and then back to normality, or I should say the new normality, depending on where we are in relation to our journey. And equally, in the context of global change, climate change, all of those elements that perhaps weren't in existence 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and even only going back 5 years ago, that if you consider a global pandemic and then the geopolitical instabilities that we now face over the past 3-5 years, perhaps we never considered that previously to become a real event within our timescales. I mentioned about the 6 professional practices. 6 professional practices have been drawn up by the Business Continuity Institute. They're very pragmatic, and they can be applied to a number of different types of organizations irrespective of scale. And main purpose to get across today is that however big, small your organization is, there's value in trying to apply a business continuity perspective in a proportionate and justifiable way within your own operating environment. And then lastly, I'll talk about how to bring that all together to ultimately make your organization more resilient to withstand disruption. And that also includes making the individuals involved with roles and responsibilities and affected by those events to become more resilient. So the first question to ask is, what is business continuity? So the official international definition, as highlighted on this slide, talks about it's the capability of the organization to continue delivery of products and services at an acceptable predefined level. So we're not trying to deal with everything that your organization does. We're trying to identify the prioritized products, services, the processes, activities, and I'll explain what they are in the context of business continuity, so that ultimately, when you're faced with that disruption, you've got the capacity to carry on those prioritized activities to sustain the organization resilience. So in essence, we're talking about the survivability of the organization to deal with those prioritized product, services, and activities. One of the key elements that I identified previously is that when we look at business continuity as a discipline, on occasion, there's a danger that people perceive business continuity to be emergency management, to be risk management, all of the other elements that form the wider integrated approach. Yes, it has a place to play, but when you look at business continuity as a discipline, it's there to deal with the impact management or the consequence management of the event you're actually dealing with. So if, for example, you lose access to your building, it doesn't really, or it's not really that bothered about whether you lost access to the building through a gas explosion, through a fire, through a water leak, through a sinkhole. The fact is you've lost access to that building. And that's where business continuity then kicks in to then identify what's the impact from that loss of access to the building. What are we actually going to do about that? So in that sense, in one way, you could say that business continuity is quite focused on consequence management and impact management. But collectively, we need to be aware of the other disciplines and the events to try to assist us. So business continuity management is a term that's used within the industry quite frequently. But ultimately, if you look at this process, the areas highlighted in red, yes, we need to do that identification of potential threats to the organization. So we need to understand our operating environment, and that could be natural or human hazards. What does that look like within your organization in the location that you're positioned? And that could apply to various things from people. It could be about, as Lisa's identified, living in an earthquake zone. All of those areas, have we identified those potential threats? And by doing so, we try to do that initial assessment in relation to the impacts that if they occur, what should we do in preparation? And collectively, we try to build organizational resilience. And the term organizational resilience is now coming to the fore as much as what business continuity is really. And there is some discussion globally about the term business continuity. Would it be better to call it resilience, organizational resilience, or operational resilience? For example, within the finance industry, they've really embraced the term operational resilience as opposed to business continuity. If you look at how they're trying to apply that globally within the finance markets, you tend to find it's exactly the same framework that's possibly being used, just that they've changed the term to slightly make it more attractive, I would suggest, in relation to events that they've identified from, the financial crash going back to 2008 and the results of the global pandemic. But if you wrap that all together, ultimately, what we hope to achieve is to have an effective response capability pre-event, during, and post-event, so that collectively we make the organization more resilient. So I mentioned at the start of the presentation around how to bring all of this together and where business continuity actually sits. So from this slide, if you look at the left-hand part of the slide, it talks about risk management and the international standard enterprise risk management 31000. And that could include making all risk assessments in relation to your environment. So for example, if you consider wildfires, yes, we've got risk assessments potentially in relation to wildfires, but have we considered other elements such as smoke particles? Have we built that into our framework to try to address that as best as we possibly can as part of that risk mitigation processes. Then once we've done that, you can move on to business as usual because normality is at this current state in time. But something will then happen, such as an incident, a crisis, etc., will trigger that event in relation to that emergency response. And that could be, in the initial stages, it could be something as simple. If you consider a fire alarm going off in your workplace, if a fire alarm goes off at that moment in time, it's probably a low-level incident. If you look statistically, most fire alarms may well be false alarms. However, until we've actually identified that that fire alarm is a false alarm, we may well evacuate the building, do our roll calls to identify who's been within the building to make sure that we've evacuated everybody safely. If we then discover that there may well be a fire, if we don't contain it, that fire may well then become an emergency. And in the worst case scenario, that emergency may well become a crisis, and a crisis become a disaster, and a disaster become a catastrophe as a result of that one event. Somewhere along that continuum, business continuity will kick in. And business continuity really kicks in where perhaps your risk mitigation has not been that successful in dealing with that particular event, or perhaps the emergency wasn't contained, and now we're into business continuity that we're trying to protect the delivery of those products and services at that predefined level. And as you go through that, yes, we move into recovery and resumption, but collectively, we're trying to protect the organization. And ultimately, we want to take it back to that state of normality, or the new normality, which is becoming more apparent these days in relation to potentially saving lives, the environment, your assets, and your business. So that's how it all comes together in hopefully a simplistic way to highlight how that integrated approach around emergency, crisis management, risk management, health and safety all come together to add value to that wider resilience perspective. So moving on to the next slide. So the next slide talks about the benefits of business continuity. And there's only a quick overview in relation to organizations that tend to have business continuity programs within the organization that have been tested and validated tend to find that when that disruption takes place, they're in a better, stronger position to deal with that event because they've done the training, they've got the plans in place, and ultimately they've got that collaboration with other professional disciplines within the organization, internally and externally, to be confident that they can deal with that event. Those are the benefits that really should be linked to the strategic objectives of the organization. And by doing so, you can see the value both to the individual and the organization and the community that your organization is taking this seriously. And it gives you that competitive advantage really when it comes to tendering, procurement processes. You'll be ahead of the game in relation to having that capacity and that ability to demonstrate that you're resilient as an organization. I mentioned about the 6 professional practices. I'll break these down as we go through the session, but in essence, we talk about how we're going to establish that business continuity management system through to embracing BC by taking people on that journey. We talk about analysis, which on occasion, those of you who may have previously been involved in business continuity may find that process quite daunting, but I will simplify that in a more proportionate and justifiable way that can be applied to small, medium, and large scale enterprises. Then we'll talk about the solutions, and then enabling solutions really talks about how we apply that in the workplace and make it your implementation processes, your design structure, and your BC plans. And then the validation process to do that double loop learning so that collectively we've got confidence that our BC plans will work when that disruption actually takes place. And equally, those with roles and responsibilities have the confidence to carry out those functions because we've upskilled them to be able to make those difficult decisions in times of need. So a question for yourselves really, and please shout out, because I say more engagement that we have in relation to the real world. So for example, we've turned up at work at 9 o'clock on that Monday morning, and as we know that suddenly we're faced with a weekend of wildfires that have been reported within your region, irrespective of whether you may be. So there's a degree of poetic license attached to the scenario. But for example, the BC Wildfire Service are advising organisations and communities to be prepared for the potential disruption in the coming days. I ask this as an open question for anybody who jump in the sense of what would your initial thoughts be if you're a business owner or a senior manager or a middle manager in relation to what that potential impact of that consequence could mean to your organization. Anybody want to come in with any thoughts or dialogue?
Thank you,
Please don't
Paul.
be shy.
Yes, I'm really inviting the participants to share your thoughts. I know there's been communities that really can relate to this experience itself. Really looking forward to hearing what were your thoughts? What are the first things that come to mind? And would you be interested in sharing them with us so I can share it with all of you? So I can see, that notification, people need to notify. We need to talk about what our communication plan will be. And that would be my initial thoughts. Paul, what do we do? What is on the burner of our role to communicate both to our teams within the workplace, to our potential customers if they're impacted? I mean, those are some of the thoughts I have. What are your thoughts on that, Paul?
Yes, certainly. One of the key elements is one to establish what is actually happening to get that situation awareness. And the warning plans are very important in the sense of getting those messages out to, as you say, your workforce, your employees, the community, customers, because ultimately those initial actions, instead of people traveling to that environment, to that workplace, you may well be able to instigate those initial actions that prevent that escalation. And before getting to the point of, that we've got people in a set location, those warning systems, whether you've got call tree systems or communication systems already in place, they can get those messages out quite quickly. And equally, in the initial thoughts, if you do have business continuity plans, you may well be, just going to those plans in the first place to say, right, okay, if we get loss of access to our buildings, if the road network is closed or they instigate an emergency evacuation, etc., what does that actually mean for us as an organization? And being on the front foot can give you that advantage as opposed to, dare I say, that panic mode when things start escalating and you think to yourself, yeah, I've prepared this in advance. I've got time at this moment in relation to that situation and that scenario that gives you that additional golden hour activity to think, right, what am I actually dealing with here? What I need to do in the first place. And that's easier said than done. I don't sit here in the sense of saying, oh yeah, that's easy. But the more preparation and planning that we've considered as part of that process gives you that additional time and capacity to deal with it in a calm way, as opposed to being, overwhelmed with activities.
So Paul, we got a few responses, which is great. From Allison, my first thoughts would be to immediately coordinate with operations to determine what to communicate and when we may look at closures as advised by the government. As an essential service, closing is the last option. So you have different types of businesses, one being an essential service. So looking at that as a consideration, Paul. And then, of course, we have another respondent. Mary, thank you. Assess distance from the wildfire for risk to employees traveling to and from work. Review the supply chain and assess potential disruptions. And then really looking at the channel of communication we're going to use with our teams. So lots of great feedback. Thank you. Your thoughts on those preliminary responses?
Yeah, absolutely, especially essential services. So, for example, if you're a health environment, if you're a hospital, if you're a residential care home, all of those issues, you start thinking about, why, if we had to evacuate this hospital, if we had to evacuate intensive care units or critical beds in relation to that environment, how do we actually do that? What does it look like in reality? And how soon do we actually need to press that button in relation to respond to that event? And equally, supply chain management, again, we'll come on to that ironically, because if we're going to be affected by that, the suppliers coming into your location are probably going to be struggling and, having the same thought processes as we probably do. And this is where, as we go through today's presentation, we'll talk about supply chain management, outsourced service providers. Who are they? Do we test and validate their business continuity plans in collaboration with us? Because ultimately, our reputation, our capacity may well be subject to single points of failure as a result of somebody else not doing that function. So that's how we start thinking about it. But hopefully, in those initial thoughts, it is a case of looking at warning communication, looking at your environment, and looking at the situation awareness and where, if you've ideally got business continuity plans in place, together with that wider picture.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Lisa. So moving on then, The first of the 6 professional practices, and I'll keep this reasonably brief, but to give you an idea that if you're new to business continuity, and it may well seem as a daunting prospect in relation to developing a BC plan, some of the key things that we just need to consider as part of those interrelated activities. So try to coordinate this in a meaningful way. So first of all, the question that we need to ask ourselves with the top management team is, what's the scope of your business continuity plan? You're not trying to deal with everything. You're trying to deal with those prioritized high-level activities that are going to add value to the organization. And by doing so, we can then establish a relatively simple policy around your business continuity framework. Then they move on to that high level of governance, who's got responsibility and accountability from the top management team in relation to your business continuity program. And ideally, you tend to find that if you don't get that buy-in from the top management, trying to successfully embrace and embed business continuity as a discipline is going to be that much harder. And I guess that equally applies to health and safety, risk management, IT security, you name it. If you don't get the buy-in and the proactive buy-in from the leadership at a high level, the job in relation to successfully promoting this discipline is going to be that much harder. The third point, we'll talk about objectives in relation to business continuity management as we go through the process. And then the fourth point really talks about we need to understand the processes, and more importantly, in that sense, who's got roles and responsibilities? Have they been trained in relation to making those decisions, in relation to dealing with that disruption? And have they been tested and validated so that both individuals and team cohesiveness have been tested to make sure that we've got the best people at the right place at the right time to deal with disruption? Collectively, that needs to be validated. So we do that double loop learning in relation to the life cycle around business continuity to make sure that we've developed a plan, but until we've actually tested it and validated it through exercising, we don't actually know it's going to work. So that's a very important point. And many organizations on occasion miss that final part out. And then lastly, again, we continuously look at this process to improve the system, develop resilience, so that constantly looking at case studies, industry best practices, real life examples, lessons learned from exercising to try to build that continuous improvement across the organization. And then the second professional practice that they talk about is known as embracing BC. Previously, I was talking to Lisa and Jean about we've changed the term from embedding, whereas embedding business continuity really suggested that we've got policies and we've got regulation in place to try to embed business continuity within the organization. What you tend to find is that most organizations fail to successfully embed business continuity because it's not dissimilar to a carrot and stick approach. The policy says this, and this is what you must do. Whereas embracing is now trying to take people on that journey to make business continuity a viable option and an attractive option to both individuals so that they can see the benefit to themselves and the organization to try to make business continuity become business as usual. So it's building the culture of the organization. That includes promoting awareness, competencies, training, so that they can see the benefit within the organization in relation to the value that the organization is placing on business continuity. And equally, we change the attitudes and behavior, and that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time to try to embrace BC to become business as usual. And that includes training, awareness programs, and as I say, we try to move it from head to heart as opposed to coming down from policy, regulation, legislation, etc., to say that you must do this. Well, experience will show us probably over the last 15, 20 years, that really hasn't worked successfully in relation to saying that you must do it. You need to take people on that journey. And there's probably a blend between both. So that very high level overview of those management practices. So we can then move forward. So it was 9 o'clock previously. So moving that inject forward to 11 a.m. So given that the developing situation and the increased threat from the wildfires, your top management team, whoever they may be, irrespective of the size of the organization, I've asked you that question, which they have the knack of asking this question when you're on the cusp of a potential emergency or a disaster or a crisis, to ask you, okay, what are our prioritized products, services, processes, and activities that apply to your organization if it was impacted by a disruptive event? And when we talk about products, what does your organization actually do, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be a service, and the processes and activities underneath those products and services to actually deliver that. So these are some of the awkward questions on occasions that top management team may well ask during that process. but have we actually identified what your prioritized processes actually are to deliver against a disruptive event? And I'll throw it open again as we move forward with this inject.
Excellent. And we do have some feedback, which is great. So decisions needing to be made and communicated very quickly, knowing who's doing what could really become important and critical, and really practice for that response team as well. So there was some comments earlier about the importance of ensuring that the emergency response team know what to do and they're qualified and trained in the different scenarios. So really important additions I wanted to share with all of you. And also considering a process around our machine shutdown for those facilities that may have, well, machines that needing to be, locked out or shut down, or if you have toxic process gas on your facilities and premise, right? What is the impact to the organization and to the communities based on what's contained in the business itself?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I'll come back. It's interesting when we talk about the next professional practice 3 analysis, when we talk about shutdowns, go back to 2017. I was working for the health service in the UK at that moment in time, where on a Friday evening, the organizations, not globally, it did affect global organizations, but nationally, there was a cyber attack. As usual, these things happen 6:20 on a Friday where people have disappeared. Some of the trusts, the hospital organizations, as usual, they rang up their IT service desk and say, look, we think that we'll be subject to a cyber attack. What should we do? And that poor individual at the end of that desk, probably, on overtime, working, coming up towards the weekend, basically said to them, yeah, unplug your systems and turn them off. Some hospital trusts took that literally to turn off CT machines, MRI scanners. And bearing in mind that in that initial stage, they're still trying to develop the situation awareness. However, what that then saw was that nobody actually knew, although they'd done the due diligence in relation to, yeah, we can do without a CT scanner for say 60 minutes or 4 hours at the timescales. What they didn't realize that if it's been unplugged for some time, you then need to get technicians from Philips and Hitachi to come and recalibrate those machines. But considering that it happened across the UK on a widespread scale, there wasn't enough technicians to then come back to recalibrate the machine. So that became an issue in relation to many hospital trusts. So yeah, do we actually understand if we turn something off, what does that actually mean in 12 hours time or 24 hours time? Is there a backup system or a backlog capacity issues in relation to turning those systems on? So just an example that I never knew it, but these things are probably hidden away somewhere until you actually go through that process, you're not totally aware of them.
Yeah, and that's why they're so individualized, right? Really understanding the impact of shutting something off and turning something on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned analysis. Those of you who are familiar with business continuity, some people get concerned about the analysis phase. Yes, the analysis phase takes time. It's not overly complicated and it needs to be proportionate to the needs of the organization. But they talk about 2 types of events that happen within the analysis. The first is the business impact analysis, in the sense of identifying what the disruption over time means to your capacity to deliver, your prioritized activities and, the business of the organization. And then secondly, once you've done the analysis, you do the risk assessment in relation to those prioritized activities. And this collectively needs to be mindful of the original risk assessment that we talked about as part of that initial stage about all hazard approach and how this collectively comes together. By going through that process, and I sit here confidently that that process around analysis doesn't need to be that complex. On occasion, small, medium enterprises become fearful of that purely on the basis that there's a lot of legacy issues around trying to do an analysis phase that is overwhelming, is overly complicated. In reality, you can keep it as simple as you possibly can in relation to your organization. And that, by doing so, we can then develop the strategies to deal with that impact in relation to those prioritized products, services, and activities. I'll mention this slide very, very briefly, only in the sense that the business continuity environment tries to break it down into project services, processes, and activities. Project and services is really about what's important to your organization from a strategic perspective. And it allows you to concentrate on the key things that the organization and your customers, a reasonable person, would expect you to do. So say hypothetically, you're an ambulance service. Your ambulance service, probably from a service perspective, at a very high level, will look to, consider things such as saving life, responding to 911 calls, responding to major incidents, all of those things that a reasonable person would expect an ambulance service to deliver. So in that sense, your projects and services are very high level. They don't need to go into too much detail. The processes that support the delivery of, say, that ambulance trust or that ambulance service could be making sure that we've got a call center that can answer 911 calls. We've got the telephony, we've got the technology, we've got the computer-aided dispatches, we've got radio networks, all of those things that, from a high-level perspective, we want to respond to something, but what are the processes underneath that? And that's where we drill down further through process mapping to understand what those dependencies are and what it actually looks like in reality. And that also includes talking about suppliers, outsourced service providers. And then the activity is the doing part, in the sense of we need ambulance crew staff, we need the vehicles, we need the equipment within the vehicle. And that's where suppliers, outsourced service providers really come to fruition in relation to that analysis phase. So that's a very simplistic view in relation to analysis, but it doesn't need to be overly complicated in the context of what we're actually hoping to achieve. A simpler process on occasion works better than being overly complicated. Having said that, though, if you're a very technical manufacturing-based organization, the process will be that much more detailed than perhaps a more simplistic organization. As you then move forward, you've got all of those findings, you've done the analysis. That then allows you to develop the solutions to take forward, to develop proportionate responses and situations that you can apply within the workplace to try and protect those prioritized activities. And that also talks about undertaking risk and threat assessments in relation to trying to protect those solutions. So for example, you may well have developed something that is cost effective within the organization that is going to protect those prioritized activities. And again, they need to be proportionate and they need to be achievable. So for example, if we design a solution that's going to cost the organization $5 million, but your annual turnover is 500,000, well, clearly there can be a disproportionate requirement in relation to that. We just need to try to make it proportionate and achievable for the organization. And some of those solutions probably can be based around the understanding of the organization and how we bring everything together to get that end result. That said, though, we also talk about risk and threat and mitigation measures. So we try to protect those solutions as best as we possibly can. And ultimately, we're not trying to protect the organization against every single conceivable threat. We're trying to deal with single points of failure and unacceptable levels of risk. And this is where, as a concept, we try to work in collaboration with other disciplines within the organization, internally, externally, so that we try to get the best return on our investment, avoid duplication. And by doing so, we've got a better chance of dealing with that disruption. If you're still with me, this slide just talks about timescales. That the more complex the organization on occasion, or the more complex the activity that you're trying to protect, you may well need to get that back up and running in seconds, minutes, or a few hours. So for example, if you use the analogy about the ambulance service, if their call center or control room goes down and 911 calls can't be made, well, clearly they need to get that back up and running in a few seconds, minutes, or hours. Otherwise, lives will be lost. And depending on your recovery time objectives, as you've done through the analysis, you tend to find that the longer the recovery time objective, the less detail that's actually required in the solution and the cheaper the solution. The shorter the recovery time objective, the more expensive the solution. So you can see a direct correlation. How quickly you need to get things back up and running will cost you more money and more resources in relation to how prepared your organization is. And again, that's why we try to break it down into bite-sized chunks by taking it in small steps to identify what do we really need to focus our efforts on, as opposed to trying to deal with everything within the organization itself. And there's a lot there to consider. So if we take that all into account, if we can bring our scenario forward now to 2 p.m. So 2 p.m., the wind has changed direction, and now there's indications that your business is going to be affected by the wildfires, and that could be through smoke, it could be through the actual fire itself. But have you considered solutions around certain key elements. And this is pretty standard within the industry about loss of people. So do people actually need to be in the workplace, or have you actually lost that capacity? If your organization needs critical staff to get into a workplace, what happens when you got loss of premises? And that could be through, it could be about industrial action. It could be about a sinkhole that takes place, not just about wildfires. Again, we're dealing with the consequence and the impact. What happens when you lose IT? For example, have cables been damaged? Has your IT system been damaged? And it comes on to supply chain network, outsourced service providers, and utilities. If, for example, you've not got backup generators, depending on how those generators will work, but have we considered that in that process? But something for yourselves to consider, but are those elements that perhaps you've already considered within your own organizations moving forward in relation to what you're trying to protect in relation to that disruption?
Yeah, looking forward to the audience. Any thoughts to share? I know last week at the Make It Safe Okanagan, some of our members shared their experiences with us in regards to the supply chain disruption from the fires it was actually last August, and then prior to that, the November 2022 flood. And really for these companies, they even had a bigger impact than the temporary evacuation from last August due to the tremendous impact due to the supply chain that incurred as a result of the Coquihalla being shut down and diverted. So that was one, I think, that was a real learning from our discussions. Any others, or anyone like to share some of their thoughts on the challenges posed from any experiences from any of these, whether it's a wild flood or the fires that transcended in 2022. I know that there's a lot to think about. Making sure it's real is important. And you mentioned having a strategy, but it has to be meaningful for achievable for the organization.
Yeah, I pick it up on that, Lisa, as well. With supply chains, many organizations now, when they enter into tendering processes or procurement processes, are now building in that those suppliers have to produce evidence in relation to their business continuity plans to say that you're pivotal to the success of our operation. If you fail, we fail. However, the responsibility falls on the parent organization. So again, it's been interesting to see the lessons learned from the global pandemic. Now organizations are building into service level agreements agreed by contract that we want to see your business continuity plans, and part of that planning process should be actually testing and validating as part of the wider picture within that exercise regime as well. So that's a positive that's actually come out from disruptions over the last 3 to 4 years.
Absolutely. And then if, of course, you think of the perishable products, right? When you talk about timelines, that's another additional constraint, right?
Absolutely. I'll move forward, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to engage. Special practice 5, they talk about enabling solutions. That's really about turning all those strategies and solutions into meaningful action about your response structures and your business continuity plans to make sure that they're fit for purpose and that those with roles and responsibilities have got the capacity to carry out that function. And I'll move forward to scenario 4 as time is moving on, in the sense that roles and responsibilities is very important in the sense that we've upskilled people to carry out those functions. So as we move forward to inject 4, we've now moved on to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the situation, as you can imagine, is now potentially evolving into an evacuation order that may be applied to your organization. And I'd just be interested, those of you who have got business continuity plans, what would your business continuity plan or suggest as a response? And have you got any life experiences in relation to whether it be flooding or wildfires or anything else in relation to instigating your BC plan as a result of a real event, and be able to share any potential experiences?
Yeah, really inviting the audience to share in terms of what does your business continuity, if you have one plan, suggest as a response? I mean, there's been discussion on the challenges on scheduling challenges with employees dealing with evacuations at home. Clearly, there's individuals, if they are in the evacuation zone, you'll know that those individuals would need to go home and support that. and fatigue for the ones who can make it in. So, I mean, there's obviously a huge psychological impact during this time for everyone. And we have to prepare and acknowledge that we have to be prepared to support that where we can.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa.
And Patricia also shared that they were affected in several levels. Supply chain employees unable to attend the facility due to highway being closed, reducing their production. So when we have all of those pieces, have from what we've all experienced, does your business continuity plan now have to have that? Has it changed as a result of that? Is there any pieces that you can add to the conversation of what has changed in your plan to help others take those key gold nuggets away?
Thanks, Lisa, because normally, although they talk about, we have a loss of people, loss of premises, they never work in isolation. There's a blended approach in relation to one has a knock-on effect on the other, so that collectively, how prepared are we in relation to that disruption? I'll just move on swiftly to the next slide. And please, this applies to best practice, not just around business continuity plans, but on occasion, you tend to find that plans have been written for, I would suggest, auditors on occasion, as opposed to the end user. But what they suggest is that plans should be direct, adaptable, concise, and relevant, together with being verifiable, unambiguous, and ordered. And there's some key points there, but ultimately, the plan should take people to the pages that they actually need to go to when that disruption takes place. And trying to keep it concise as opposed to being full of superfluous information on occasion can be a challenge depending on the culture of the organization. But trying to apply direct, adaptable, concise, relevant, etc., is a very good framework to apply not just to business continuity plans, but also to emergency plans and how that actually looks like as well. As part of the presentation, and I guess it'll be available, there will be on the next slide a framework in relation to BC plans that can be used to assist you. I shan't go into depth at this moment in time, given the time constraints, but please feel free to either reach out to myself around the content of BC plans and how to make them, succinct and to the point, rather than being 200 pages and you think to yourself, really, how am I actually going to use that in times of need? So that then takes us on to the final element of the 6 professional practices about validation. And again, what we learned from COVID-19 is that many organizations went through the difficulty of going through analysis and the validation stage. However, they didn't actually go to actually testing and validating their plans, which is a shame, really. They just put them on the shelf and never actually made sure that the plans actually work. So the validation stage consists of exercising, maintenance, and review. And I'd just be interested, before we got on to the next inject, is that similar to yourselves? Do you have an exercise program on an annual basis or a 2-yearly basis that really tests, communication channels? It tests whether it be tabletop exercises through to live events to make sure that the systems that you hope to work in that time of disruption will actually progress in reality and be achievable. But I'll throw that open for any discussion.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone from the audience would like to share their experience through their tabletop exercises or through their testing and validation of their continuity programs? I know that there's a lot more happening with cybersecurity and related activities on tabletop exercises, Paul. Building systems to be able to test what they can and can't do, because that happens quite quickly when cyber threats occur. So I do recall that there's many organizations walking through that, including we're thinking of that ourselves. So let's look at this. Would this be a good way for businesses to evaluate if their ERT is capable enough to manage the situation, or if they require more training? So a really good point, ensuring that they do have the skills necessary and walking that through a tabletop exercises. Your thoughts on that, Paul?
Absolutely. I'm so passionate about the exercising, making sure that we got the right people in the right place, and that plan is actually achievable and meaningful to those end users. And this is where, we can build in the wider program about that integrated framework, not just around business continuity. We can start off with an evacuation. So we test fire alarms, we test fire drills, then we can move it forward about other elements, and that can include health and safety in relation to risk assessments, depending on what they're actually dealing with. So trying to bring that together, absolutely. don't be limited to think that we just have to keep it with business continuity. You can get a win-win through other disciplines to get that message across in a wider context.
Paul, there's a question. Any ideas on tests that can be performed? Do you suggest some better ones versus those that maybe aren't as effective?
Personally, from a cost-benefit analysis, I quite like desktops and walkthroughs so that we take people on that journey in the initial stage. Yeah, some organizations may well be subject to legal or regulatory requirements that they must hold a live exercise. I think the finance industry, who I was working with yesterday, that they must hold tests or live tests every 12 months. You go to the nuclear industry, certainly always used to be every 2 years or possibly 3 years. So there's different types of tests and environments. And again, if people want to reach out to me, I could probably share those examples and scenarios with them. Yeah, some of them are very basic, but normally on occasion, if you just ask people, right, you've turned up at work on a Monday morning, there's been a sinkhole, what are you going to do? That normally drains the blood from people's faces in terms of saying, I've not really considered this. And it could be as simple as that. That can be done over a 2-hour period just to get the dialogue working. And you can bring into that being your current business continuity plan to say, right, what would you actually do? So it doesn't need to be overly complicated. However, sometime, whether it be on an annual basis, 2-yearly basis, having a potential live exercise can add value, but I wouldn't jump to that in the initial stages because ultimately there's a danger you're going to destroy people's confidence as you move forward. And ultimately, we want to take people on that journey to be in the right place at the right time.
So Paul, if you have those resources, we'll include them in what we distribute to our viewers here today, because they'll be circulated. So that would be great. Thank you for that offer.
I'll just move quickly on. Yeah, there's a definition in the slide deck in relation to what the exercise is hoping to achieve, i.e. train, assess, practice, and improve performance, because ultimately we want to build confidence up in relation to those key elements. The other 2 elements within the validation talks about maintenance of your BC program. And again, we probably all come across different parts of different disciplines there. Perhaps I'll turn up with version 10 of the plan, and then Lisa might turn up with version 12, Anna turn up with version 8, and then Jean turn up with version 16. We just need to make sure that if we review our plans, we recall the old plans, whether it be through electronic means or hard copies, to make sure that we've got that schedule in place. And then when we talk about the review process, on the next slide, it talks about the different types of review from audit all the way through to management reviews, supply chain performance appraisals. All of those types of review can add value to your organization. I wouldn't suggest that you need to do all of them, but as you develop and mature your business continuity program, it's like walking down a supermarket or a grocery store. You just choose the ingredients that are applicable to your organization and make them meaningful and achievable. So you add value to that double loop learning in that context. So that brings us up to virtually the end of the presentation in the sense of, yeah, you've gone through this scenario, 10 p.m. at night, there's a sudden change in wind direction, and we're now into the process of debriefing in relation to trying to establish what worked well, what didn't work well, and how you can improve that process and the actions you take forward in relation to making your organization and the individuals more prepared, more resilient to deal with disruptions. But any thoughts from the presentation itself of perhaps what you would take forward in the real world as opposed to this theoretical world of the ISO standard and what business continuity actually looks like, but taking it into the operational perspective and making it real within the workplace? And we got any thoughts?
Yes, looking forward to your thoughts from the audience. No, I think it's absolutely important. It's got to be realistic. It's got to be tested. You know, in a systems format versus a programs, there's an automatic review cycle, which is critical, right? We need to make sure we're reviewing them. Do you have an evaluation process built into your emergency response and business continuity plan? What's important to include in this process? Paul?
Yeah, I certainly do. And again, I can share that with yourselves in the sense of, one, the evaluation in relation to the maturity of your BC program. And there's always a balance between quantity and quality. So that historically, the evaluation process, for example, your BC program has always considered how many business continuity plans have you written? How many analysis have you undertaken? How many exercises? That's very much based on percentage figures. What they tend to, or what they've missed over the years is that that's the quantity. We want the quality. So the quality, as opposed to, you may well be hitting the target in relation to percentage figures, but those plans, unless they've been validated, mean actually absolutely nothing. So it's hitting the target, but totally missing the point. So again, I can share those, and the evaluation methods I use in relation to exercising, there's no rocket science attached to it, but that feedback in relation to how well the exercise went, what worked well, the feedback, so that we can try to bring that together so that we can move that forward, lessons learned, lessons identified, and hopefully we can address that within the wider BC program to make it more resilient. And dare I say it, those end users with roles and responsibilities, I tend to find they're not shy in coming forward if that exercise hasn't gone particularly well, or if the plan doesn't meet their requirements. They're quite critical, and they should be, really, because ultimately they are the ones with the responsibility to carry out that function.
Absolutely. Communication planning and testing the plan, not to mention get feedback from employees. I think that's critical. Did they get enough information and in a timely manner? I think excellent. Paul, your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. If I can say technically, those operational users probably know where the vulnerabilities exist. They understand the culture of the organization, what they can or cannot do. On occasion, they may well be a silent voice until that real event takes place. So using those together with speaking with the top management team and middle management team, but don't forget those participants at the coalface, I would suggest, probably understand what works well and what those vulnerabilities actually look like. And it probably makes them feel uncomfortable. But don't forget about those. That triangulation of information will give you the best outcome. Absolutely.
Opening up to questions, looking at the time. Is this the last slide, Paul?
Yeah, I'll bring it on just to highlight as well. I work with the University of Victoria. There's a number of courses, 6-week courses and 12-week micro-credential courses that talk about emergency management all the way through to crisis management, business continuity. And there's a number of different scenarios. They're short, succinct, to the point, but it is a useful tool just to engage with that process. We've got the next course starting on the 6th of May in relation to a 12-week program. But again, it just brings everything that we've talked about today into that integrated framework, but brings it really into the British Columbia perspective, as opposed to just looking at business continuity from an international perspective. So you get best practice across a number of things. I'll pause there because that's the final slide.
Thank you so much, Paul. What a valuable presentation. And once again, will be circulated and prepared and circulated to all of our attendees here today. Really turning to the audience, to your questions, I want to get to a few. I know the time is ticking, but really opening up the opportunity for our attendees today. Is there a sample plan that can be provided to us with all the points that are required? Is that included in your resources, Paul?
That's a good one, because I will share what should be included within a plan, and then apply it within your own organization. Because again, that's where the danger is. People develop plans, and the worst one I've seen is about 236 pages. And unless we lose electricity or hydro facilities, it would be useful just to burn that plan, just to keep warm. But apart from that, the end users had no value for it whatsoever. So in that sense, yeah, I can share a template or the key points that perhaps you should consider within the BC plan itself. It'll take me a couple of days to pull that together, but yeah, more than happy to share what best practice looks like.
Wonderful. And the last question before we close is, what is the most overlooked of the principles that you shared today from your wealth of experience?
Right. I would suggest it's embracing as opposed to the analysis. It's the fact that if you don't make it attractive to those individuals and the organization, suddenly you've lost people on a journey, and we go through a tick box culture. I think that's the biggest challenge. And people are fearful of the term business continuity. Really, it can be simplistic. And if you need any guidance, assistance with that, please feel free to reach out to me. You've got my email address, because again, I'm quite passionate. Keep it simple, and we can make it realistic and achievable. And it doesn't need to be a costly exercise in that sense.
What a great place to stop. Everyone has a role to play in the process, and it's really important that we know what that is, and it builds a culture, right? Like we do with health and safety. So thank you, Paul, for joining us, and to everyone in the audience, thank you for sharing your questions, your experiencing with with us today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to respond in the follow-up. So please know that we will do our best to do that. And if you think of a question after today, please don't hesitate to share it with us. We'll make sure we get your response. There are other considerations, as you know, that employers will be responsible for transportation and seeing the care of injured workers within emergency services more than 30 minutes away. So on November 1st, the first aid regulations here in BC have been updated. I just wanted to share that with you. For more information on that, watch our recorded webinar on first aid, or tune in this July. We will host another webinar on this topic. So once again, our Alliance advisors as well will help you as you work through your plans. Contact us anytime for advice, support, and training. So moving on to the closing remarks, Safety and Health Week, I wanted to share with all of you, 2024 is coming up very, very fast. To equip you and your safety committee with the tools you need from May 6th to 16th, we'll be offering an instructor-led class every day, from sessions on joint health and safety and incident investigations to train the trainer. 11 different training classes around the Lower Mainland and of course in Prince George as well. Please use the link to secure your seats now. We are also traveling and doing workshops in Prince George on May the 8th. This day is free, complimentary for Alliance members, and only $129 for non-members. So if anyone on our viewers here today are in the area, please sign up. We look forward to seeing you in Prince George. If you haven't heard, Safety Meta World launched last week. It is new immersive training, engaging, shown to improve retention by 60%, a new way to engage using gamification and immersive technology to demonstrate and apply health and safety in a simulated environment without the real risk of the world, which is really an interesting way to be able to share that with all of you, and integrates both the physical and psychosocial risks. The two new courses are Hazard ID and Control and Workplace Inspections. It is 2 courses really for one bundle price. So look forward to hearing from you as individuals consider taking those options for training. And then finally, moving on to another event, Thursday, May 23rd, for a virtual town hall on bridging the future skills gap for operations and safety. Please bring your questions for government, industry leaders, and CME's chief economist to this important online discussion. And then, of course, in June, come celebrate safety excellence and leadership at this year's Safety Pinnacle Awards Gala. It's always a wonderful time to meet and network, and we really have a lot of fun at this event. So inviting all of you, ticket registration is open, and please do join us. And as always, visit us online anytime for help or to access our full library of webinars, resources, and training. Watch for an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of today's session and a survey link to share your feedback and topic ideas. Thank you all for attending today. Stay safe.